For 3,000 years, nobody knew that a pharaoh of Egypt had been murdered inside his own palace. The embalmers who prepared his body knew. They saw the wound. And they spent hours disguising it, wrapping it, hiding it under layers of linen and resin so convincing that it fooled every archaeologist who examined that mummy for over a century. It took a hospital CT scanner in 2012 to finally see what 3,000 years of bandages were built to conceal. And once scientists saw it, an ancient conspiracy that had only ever existed on a fragile piece of papyrus suddenly had a body attached to it. This isn't a one-off story either. Over the last 20 years, radiologists and Egyptologists working together have quietly run CT scanners over dozens of the most famous mummies in history. And every single time, the machine has found something the naked eye, the X-ray, and a century of careful unwrapping had all missed. Murders confirmed. Diseases identified. Identities settled. Curses explained away by mold spores and infected mosquito bites. This is that story, told through the actual scans, the actual journals, and the actual scientists whose names are attached to the findings, because the true version of this is more interesting than anything you'd need to invent. The pharaoh was Rameses III, the last great warrior king of Egypt's new kingdom, who ruled from around 1186 to 1155 BC. Historians had known for over a century that someone tried to kill him. A papyrus known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, discovered in the 19th century, records the trial transcripts of a palace coup. One of the king's secondary wives, a woman named Ta, wanted her son Pentawere to inherit the throne instead of the legitimate heir. She recruited officials, harem inspectors, and even practitioners of magic to help carry out the assassination. The documents describe the plotters using wax figures and poison, and they list dozens of conspirators who were eventually tried and executed. What the papyrus never confirmed was whether the plot actually succeeded. Rameses III's mummy had been examined multiple times since its rediscovery in 1886, and nobody found a mark on it. The throat, wrapped in thick collars of linen, looked intact. For well over 100 years, Egyptologists were left with a court record describing a murder, and a body that seemed to show no evidence one had occurred. In 2012, a team led by Egyptologist Zahi Hawass and radiologist Sahar Salim finally put the mummy through a CT scanner as part of a broader project scanning New Kingdom royal mummies. What the scan revealed, published in the British Medical Journal, was a wound in the throat roughly 7 centimeters wide and deep enough to reach the vertebrae, almost certainly fatal within moments. Hidden inside that wound was a small amulet in the shape of the Eye of Horus, a healing symbol the embalmers had apparently placed there during mummification, as though trying to spiritually repair the damage they could not physically undo. The neck had then been wrapped in an unusually thick collar of linen, layer after layer, specifically at the site of the injury. It wasn't decorative. It was concealment. It's worth understanding why concealment like this was even possible in the first place. Egyptian embalming was not a crude preservation process. It was a highly skilled craft, refined over more than 1,000 years, involving the removal of internal organs, the use of natron salt to dry the body over roughly 40 days, and then the careful packing and wrapping of the remains with resins, oils, and linen. Embalmers were trusted, with the literal physical preparation of a king for eternity, and that meant they had enormous discretion over how a body would be presented for the rest of time. If a king had died in a way that was politically inconvenient, embarrassing, or dangerous to acknowledge, the embalmers were often the last people with the skill and the access to quietly correct the record. Modern radiology essentially reopened files those embalmers thought had been sealed forever. The scan didn't stop there. Researchers also examined a second mummy buried near Rameses III and long known simply as Unknown Man E. This mummy had never been given the standard royal treatment. The body wasn't eviscerated in the usual way, no incision was made to remove internal organs, and it was wrapped in what looked like a goat skin, a material considered ritually unclean in ancient Egyptian burial practice. Some Egyptologists had long suspected this was a deliberate punishment, a way of denying someone the proper rites needed to reach the afterlife. The CT scan showed the man's neck had deep folds of compressed skin, and his abdomen and chest were unnaturally inflated, patterns radiologists associated with strangulation or being buried before full decomposition, sometimes interpreted as being buried alive. Genetic testing performed on both mummies found that they shared an identical Y chromosome profile and were closely related, consistent with a father-son relationship. The circumstantial case is strong. Unknown Man E may well be Prince Pentawere, condemned by the tribunal and executed or forced to take his own life, buried without honor a short distance from the father he was accused of killing. A follow-up study by the same team went further still, comparing the angle and pattern of the throat wound against the injuries on other bodies discovered near the site. They found evidence suggesting Rameses III may have been attacked by more than one assailant using more than one weapon, based on a hacked and unhealed injury to one of his toes that appeared to have happened at nearly the same moment as the fatal neck wound, but from a different type of blade. None of this rewrites Egyptian history in some dramatic new direction. It confirms, with physical evidence, something that had only existed as an accusation on paper for 3,000 years. That is what these scans actually do. They don't invent mysteries, they close them. The most famous case of a CT scanner rewriting what we thought we knew about a pharaoh is Tutankhamun. And the story there is less about murder and more about a body that had been quietly falling apart since the day it was discovered. When Howard Carter's team opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and finally reached the mummy in 1925, they were dealing with a body that had been drenched in an enormous quantity of consecrated oils and resins during the original embalming, so much that it had essentially fused the young king to the inside of his coffin over the centuries. To remove him, Carter's team used heated knives and had to cut the mummy into pieces. Limbs were detached. The head was severed to remove the golden mask. Whatever original condition the body had been in was permanently altered by this early, damaging extraction. And for the rest of the 20th century, that damage fed a rumor that Tutankhamun had died young because of a violent blow to the back of the skull, evidence of foul play. In 1968, an X-ray of the mummy did appear to show a dense area at the base of the skull, and some researchers speculated it might be a hemorrhage caused by a strike to the head. Combined with Tutankhamun's early death around age 19 and the abrupt religious upheaval of his father Akhenaten's reign, a murder theory took hold in popular culture and stayed there for decades. It took until 2005 for Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, led by Zahi Hawass, to run a full CT scan of the mummy using a mobile scanner brought directly to the Valley of the Kings, so the body would never have to leave its tomb. 3 independent teams of radiologists from Egypt, Italy, and Switzerland analyzed more than 1,700 cross-sectional images. The dense spot at the back of the skull turned out to be embalming resin that had pooled there after death, not a hemorrhage. There was no sign of a blow. The murder theory that had circulated for nearly 40 years didn't survive contact with the actual data. But the scan found something nobody had been looking for. Tutankhamun's left femur, the large bone in the upper leg, showed a severe fracture, and unlike an old healed injury, this one showed signs of happening shortly before death, with embalming resin found inside the fracture line itself, meaning the bone was broken while there was still an open wound present at the time of mummification. A badly infected open fracture in an era without antibiotics could easily have been fatal on its own. Then, in 2010, a much larger study combining DNA testing and CT imaging on 16 royal mummies, including Tutankhamun and several members of his family, was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It found DNA from Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite responsible for the deadliest form of malaria, present in Tutankhamun. S remains, making it among the oldest confirmed cases of malaria ever documented in a human body. The same imaging also revealed he had a partially cleft palate and a club foot on one side, severe enough that more than 100 walking sticks were found buried with him in his tomb, no longer just ceremonial objects, but likely mobility aids he needed in life. His bones also showed Köhler disease, a condition where the small bones of the foot lose blood supply and begin to die. The genetic side of the study answered a question Egyptologists had debated for decades. Tutankhamun's parents, based on the DNA comparisons, were siblings, most likely Akhenaten and one of Akhenaten's own sisters, whose mummy has not been definitively named. That degree of inbreeding, common in royal Egyptian lineages trying to preserve bloodline purity, likely compounded his health problems significantly. Combine a genetically weakened immune system, a club foot that limited his mobility, a cleft palate, and then a severe leg fracture becoming infected while he was already fighting a malaria infection, and the picture that emerges isn't a murdered boy king. It's a chronically ill teenager whose body, weakened from birth, simply couldn't survive one crisis on top of another. The same 2010 study also ruled out a separate long-running theory that Tutankhamun and his relatives had Marfan syndrome, a connective tissue disorder some researchers used to explain the elongated skulls, wide hips, and long limbs seen in Amarna period royal art. The CT scans of the actual skeletons showed no evidence of the disorder. The exaggerated art style, it turns out, was almost certainly a religious and artistic convention of Akhenaten's reign, not a medical record of the family's bodies. There's an even older case that shows the same pattern of embalmers hiding damage they didn't want the afterlife to remember, and it belongs to a king who died more than a century before Tutankhamun was even born. Seqenenre Tao II ruled southern Egypt around 1558 BC, during a period when the north of the country was under the control of the Hyksos, a foreign dynasty that had taken over the Nile Delta. Egyptian tradition credited Seqenenre with beginning the War of Liberation that his sons would later finish, reunifying Egypt under native rule. When his mummy was first unwrapped in the 1880s, examiners were startled to find severe, obvious wounds to the head and x-rays. Taken in the 1960s confirmed a skull that had clearly suffered major trauma. For decades, the leading theories were that he died on the battlefield, or possibly in a palace assassination, but the crude imaging technology of the time couldn't determine exactly how many injuries there were or in what order they happened. In 2021, Sahar Salim and Zahi Hawass ran a full CT scan of Seqenenre's mummy and published their findings in the journal Frontiers in Medicine. The scan revealed 5 distinct injuries across the king's face and skull, a transverse fracture to the forehead, a gaping wound above the right eyebrow, blunt trauma across the nose and eye, socket, a sharp cut to the cheek, and a penetrating wound at the base of the skull that may have reached the brainstem. Crucially, the CT data also uncovered additional fractures on the side of the skull that had been completely hidden, packed over with embalming material by ancient morticians in a technique the researchers compared to modern reconstructive filling. Nobody examining the mummy by eye, even up close, had ever seen those particular injuries. The scan also showed that Seqenenre's hands were bent and clenched with no defensive wounds anywhere on his forearms, a pattern forensic analysts associate with someone whose hands were bound and unable to block an attack. The researchers cross-referenced the wound. Shapes against actual Hyksos-era weapons held in the Cairo Museum, axes, spears, and daggers of Levantine design, and found a close match. The conclusion Salim and Hawass reached was that Seqenenre was very likely captured on the battlefield, restrained, and then executed by multiple attackers striking from different angles with different weapons, possibly as a deliberate act of humiliation aimed specifically at his face. It's a startlingly intimate piece of forensic detail, recovered from a body that had already been dead for 3,500 years by the time X-ray machines existed, let alone CT scanners. There's a fourth case, less about a cause of death and more about identity itself, and it shows how a CT scanner can solve a mystery that has nothing to do with wounds or disease at all. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as a fully recognized pharaoh, not a regent or a king's wife, for roughly 2 decades in the 15th century BC. She commissioned major building projects, expanded trade networks, and had herself depicted in official art wearing the false beard and regalia of a male king, the standard iconography of pharaonic power. After her death, her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, ordered much of her imagery and many of her inscriptions systematically chiseled off temple walls, and her name was left out of later king lists. Her mummy, as a result, simply disappeared from the historical record along with everything else connected to her. For over a century, Egyptologists had 2 unidentified female mummies from the Valley of the Kings that were candidates, one of which had been sitting in a minor tomb known as KV 60, largely ignored, believed by some to be nothing more than a royal nurse. In 2007, Hawass organized a systematic CT scanning project of unidentified New Kingdom royal women, hoping to finally resolve the question. During that process, his team scanned a small wooden box in the Cairo Museum's collection, inscribed with Hatshepsut's cartouche, which was known to contain embalmed organs, standard practice in mummification. The scan of the box revealed something unexpected inside. Alongside the organ material was a single loose tooth. Researchers pulled the CT data on the unidentified obese mummy from KV60 and found she was missing a molar with an empty socket that matched the shape and root pattern of the tooth in the box almost exactly. It fit. The identification was announced as confirmed, and while some Egyptologists, including Salima Ikram at the American University in Cairo, urged caution given how difficult ancient DNA analysis still was at the time, the combination of the CT-matched tooth, follow-up genetic testing, and the box's inscription became strong enough evidence that the identification is now widely accepted. The scans also gave researchers a detailed medical picture of Hatshepsut in life, an obese woman in her 50s with poor dental health, diabetes, and bone cancer, likely the actual cause of death, rather than the assassination theories that had also circulated for her in the absence of hard evidence. What connects all 4 of these cases is not that ancient Egypt hid something supernatural. It's the opposite. Every one of these mysteries, a battlefield execution, a possible palace murder, a possible assassination of a boy king, the disappearance of a female pharaoh's body, existed for decades or centuries as pure speculation, kept alive because there was no way to look inside the wrappings without destroying them. CT imaging changed that completely. It let researchers see bone density, healed versus unhealed fractures, foreign objects hidden inside wrapped limbs, and even loose teeth in a completely separate container, all without unwrapping a single layer of 3,000-year-old linen. That's the actual revolution here, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's not a small one. Radiologists are now able to build near-complete medical case files for people who died before medicine, as a field even had a name. The same scanning technology has been used on Egyptian mummies far beyond the famous named pharaohs. Researchers have used CT data to build detailed facial reconstructions of unnamed mummies, identify cases of arthritis, tuberculosis, and heart disease in ordinary Egyptians, and in one widely reported 2021 study, even use scan data to render an approximation of the voice box of a priest named Nejamun in order to estimate what his vocal tract might have sounded like. None of this required cutting anyone open. It's forensic science doing what it does with living patients, applied instead to bodies that have been dead for 3 millennia. It's also worth addressing directly the idea that opening or scanning these tombs unleashes some kind of curse, because that myth has attached itself to almost every major mummy discovery since the 20th century began, and it's worth knowing where it actually came from and why it fell apart. When Lord Carnarvon, the financial backer of Howard Carter's excavation, died in Cairo in April 1923, just months after Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, newspapers ran wild with the idea of a pharaoh's curse striking down the man who disturbed his rest. Carnarvon's actual cause of death was much less mysterious. He nicked a mosquito bite while shaving, the wound became infected, and he died of blood poisoning in an era before antibiotics existed. Of the other people present at the opening of the tomb, the vast majority lived long, unremarkable lives afterward. Howard Carter himself, the man most directly responsible for opening the tomb, lived another 17 years and died of lymphoma at 64, an ordinary cause of death for the period. A 2002 study published in the British Medical Journal actually tracked the lifespans of everyone present at the tomb's opening and found no statistical difference in life expectancy compared to similar individuals who weren't there. Later, researchers proposed more grounded explanations for why some archaeologists did fall ill after opening long-sealed tombs, pointing to aspergillus mold spores that can accumulate in sealed burial chambers over centuries and can genuinely cause respiratory illness in people with weakened immune systems, along with elevated radon gas in some enclosed stone chambers. Those are real explainable hazards. They are not curses. They're the kind of environmental risk you'd expect in any airtight space that hasn't been opened in 3,000 years. And modern excavation teams now test for exactly these things before anyone goes inside. It's a useful pattern to notice because it shows up again and again in this field. Something genuinely happens. A death, an illness, an unexplained sound in a sealed chamber, and in the absence of a clear explanation, the gap gets filled with the most dramatic available story rather than the most likely one. CT scanning, radar, and muon detection exist precisely to close that gap with data instead of speculation. And in nearly every documented case where they've been applied to a famous Egyptian mystery, the mundane, verifiable explanation has won out over the supernatural one. There's one more layer to this story, and it involves not mummies, but the structures built to hold them. In 2015, an international collaboration called the Scan Pyramids Project began using a technique called muon tomography to look inside the Great Pyramid of Giza without drilling a single hole. Muons are subatomic particles constantly raining down from cosmic rays hitting the atmosphere, and they pass through solid stone far more easily than they pass through empty space, meaning detectors placed inside and around the pyramid can effectively take an X-ray of the entire structure using naturally occurring radiation. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids team, publishing in the journal Nature, announced they had detected a large void above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long, a space with no known function and no visible access point from anywhere currently excavated. It remains one of the most significant unresolved findings in Egyptology today. Researchers have proposed it could be a construction feature meant to relieve structural weight, an unfinished chamber, or something else entirely, and until an excavation permit is approved and a physical or robotic survey can confirm what's actually inside, it stays exactly what the data says it is, a real, verified, and currently unexplained empty space, sitting in one of the most thoroughly studied buildings on Earth. The same team returned in 2023 with another finding, this time using a combination of muon detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and ultrasonic testing to examine the area directly behind the pyramid's original, now hidden entrance on the north face. They confirmed the existence of a corridor-shaped void roughly 9 meters long, sitting just behind the chevron-shaped stone blocks, visible above the current tourist entrance. Egyptian antiquities officials, working with the Scan Pyramids team, later inserted a small endoscopic camera through a joint between the blocks and confirmed the corridor was real, empty, and had never been documented in any previous survey of the pyramid. Its purpose is still unknown. Some engineers believe it's another weight-relieving feature positioned above the original entrance, similar in concept to the relieving chambers built above the king's chamber deep inside the structure. Nobody is claiming it leads to a hidden burial chamber, and nobody has been permitted to physically enter it yet. What is confirmed, published, and photographed is a genuinely new architectural feature found inside a building that has been continuously studied since the 19th century using instruments that didn't exist 20 years. Hey go. Egyptology doesn't need invented data to stay interesting. It has plenty of real unresolved questions on its own, verified by multiple independent teams and sitting in peer-reviewed journals rather than restricted files nobody can access. What all of these stories share is a pattern that's easy to miss if you're only looking for shock value. A conspiracy on a papyrus becomes a throat wound under a CT scanner. A childhood legend about a murdered boy king becomes a case study in malaria, infection, and inherited disease. A pharaoh erased from her own monuments becomes identifiable again because of a single loose tooth inside a box nobody thought to open with imaging equipment. A solid stone pyramid studied for over 4,000 years still has a room-sized gap in it that nobody has entered. None of these needed exaggeration. The real findings, published in real medical and archaeological journals, checked, and in most cases rechecked by independent teams, are already strange enough to hold your attention on their own merits. That's usually the case with actual history. It rarely needs help. It's also worth being honest about the limits of this evidence, because that's part of what makes it trustworthy. CT scans can show a fracture, a foreign object, a dental match, or a parasite's DNA, but they can't always settle a debate on their own. Egyptologists still argue over the exact sequence of blows that killed Seqenenre, over whether Hatshepsut's identification should be treated as fully proven or simply the most likely explanation available, and over how much weight to put on genetic results extracted from 3,000-year-old tissue, which remains a technically difficult and occasionally disputed process. Zahi Hawass, who led or co-led nearly every study mentioned here, is a prominent and sometimes controversial figure in Egyptology, known for confident public pronouncements that not every colleague agrees with in every detail. That disagreement isn't a weakness in the field, it's what makes it science rather than folklore. A claim that gets published, scrutinized, occasionally challenged, and sometimes revised is fundamentally different from a claim that only ever exists in a video description with no paper behind it at all. If you want to see where the next chamber gets opened, the next mummy gets scanned, or the next 3,000-year-old mystery finally gets an answer, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel covers real archaeological discoveries as the research comes out, not manufactured ones. Drop a comment with which ancient mystery you want covered next, whether that's inside Egypt or somewhere else entirely, and I'll start digging into the actual data behind it for the next video.